Hello and welcome to the Sales Revolution podcast. I'm Ingrid Maynard, the founder and managing director of The Sales Doctor. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the world of advisory boards. And you may be thinking, what does that have to do with sales, with salespeople, or indeed with our beloved customers? And fair enough, if you thought only of advisory boards as being about good corporate governance. What I would love you to know is that I'm joined today by Louise Broekman, who is the founder of the Advisory Board Centre, who will introduce us to a concept that we can all embrace and the benefits as well of when we do embrace. Welcome, Louise.
Thanks, Ingrid. Lovely to be here.
Absolutely lovely to have you here. So to start us off, why did you believe that the world needed an association of best practice for advisory boards?
Well, Ingrid, advisory boards have been around since the beginning of time. We've all been providing advice to each other whether we want it or not. So but everyone's been doing their own thing. And many years ago, in my previous business, I wanted to make confident decisions about our growth strategy. And I was making decisions in my business and going, is that a good decision? I don't know, but I'm going to do it anyway. And we had a real opportunity to really grow globally. And I just thought that making decisions that way is just not good enough. So I decided to have an advisory board for my business, and it was life-changing for me. It's a well-known story where, in 5 years we grew that business to 135 offices in 8 countries. And when I sold that business, I was just very, very grateful for the opportunity to listen and be held account by a group of people I really deeply admired.
Wow.
So we spent 5 years researching, testing and validating advisory board structures around the world, but in that process found that there was no professional body looking after the sector at all. Everyone's just doing their own thing. So to bring the sector together, to formalise it and bring it to something, into a discipline and a sector all of its own, was a really important thing to do. So that was 7 years ago that we undertook that job.
Yeah, that's an incredible story, and you're a walking testimony to the benefits of having an advisory board, as you say, of people who you deeply respected. What I really wanted to do, though, is really dive into a different aspect today as well, because this is something else that we can really benefit from as business owners, or indeed as company directors. And a big part of what you do is about helping organisations utilise advisory boards more effectively, obviously by helping them understand the different types, different functions, like you said, that central point that kind of brings everything together. But what I didn't know about until you and I had that catch up recently was that you also focus on customer advisory boards. And this to me is a game changer. What is a customer advisory board and what's its purpose?
Well, it's been really interesting, Ingrid. We're now 7 years in the market as the professional body, and the evolution of advisory boards in the last 4 years has just been astonishing. So when we look at advisory boards, generally we think about the all of business advisory board, where a business owner will have advisors come in, you meet quarterly, and that's a standard model and a very effective one. But they're now being utilised in ways that instead about being about the total strategy, it's about a strategy. And one of the key markets for the project advisory boards is a customer advisory board. So where is it that an organisation actually listens to the customer, and the customer is actually being informed as part of an ecosystem of their governance structure? And this is where customer advisory boards is certainly probably one of the most advanced advisory board structures in the market today.
That's amazing. Okay, so what so you were talking about that singular function or that singular focus there. Tell me a little bit more about why a customer advisory board and how that actually helps an organisation to make better decisions when it comes to, I mean, it sounds pretty obvious that, well, if you involve your customers, you're going to make better decisions. But it's a lot deeper than that, isn't it?
Yeah, there are a few different functions of why you would have a customer advisory board. So if you look in the tech space, Salesforce, Amazon, LinkedIn, they're all really well-known cases of having customer advisory boards, and it just makes really good business sense. Why wouldn't you want to involve your customer in your co-creation of your product and your service offering, where they're informing you of how they want to consume your product or your service? It just makes really good commercial sense, great return on investment as well. They just need to be managed very well to really look at the managing people's expectations of being a customer on these advisory boards. So this is when organisations want to have an advisory board, and SaaS-based businesses is the largest consumers of customer advisory boards. And so we now see firms specialising in just customer advisory boards. So they'll establish the advisory board, they'll bring on their customers, they'll onboard them, they'll manage the quarterly meetings, they'll measure the impact on an annual basis, and they do that as an annual process with customers that they're serving. So it's a well utilised model today. In Australia, though, we now have this other dimension that's happening in customer advisory boards being led by the aged care sector. And the Australian federal government on the 1st of December in 2023 regulated that aged care providers must have a customer advisory board. So we're talking about vulnerable customers here, that they must have a voice. And I think this is a really good development, but also a sad one. I think, Ingrid, it's great that customers have a voice, but it's sad that we had to wait for regulations to come into play to give those customers a voice. And we think about most organisations today and who are their customers and where are the vulnerable customer sets within that group. And I think regulations will continue to flow through into the market, but I don't think as organisations we should wait for regulations to tell us that we must listen to our customer. That it just doesn't make sense. So we think about who are the most vulnerable customers in our sales pipelines. We've got aged care to start with. We've got disability services. We've got childcare. We've got education. We've got banking. We've got the energy sector. In every market segment, I think organisations have a responsibility to map out who their different stakeholders are, not just their customers, and say, where's the vulnerability in this and where's our social responsibility to be able to do the right thing.
I absolutely love what you've just said. I totally agree with you. And as you were sort of talking about aged care, I was thinking about, schools have kind of had school boards and they've had, what you'd probably call their customers on there. Not necessarily the children themselves, but the families, of those children are usually, front and centre in a lot of those sorts of boards. But then I was thinking about, okay, so if I was to put together a customer advisory board for my business, I might be thinking this is a fabulous idea and it's something that is a bit of a no-brainer. But I might be thinking, well, do we really need that? Because we've got focus groups, we've got, other ways that we engage with our customers. We think we engage with them pretty well. Who should be on? I mean, how do you go about putting together a customer advisory board? So let's start with who should be on a customer advisory board, and how do you go about selecting who gets a seat and who doesn't?
It all comes back down to clarity of scope, right? So the establishment phase of an advisory board is, I think, the most important part of an advisory board. So what is the purpose of having any customer feedback mechanism, and what are the different options that you've got, right? So in some environments, a think tank may be the right model, and a think tank in a way is an advisory board structure, right? So advisory boards are called all sorts of different things. But if you've got existing structures, how effective are they? How can you actually validate what the customer experience is like and what they think? And are you maximising that relationship with those customers. So we think about the customer as and also we think about supply chain. We think in a very linear way. But what if we think differently about our customer and our supply chain being part of a broader ecosystem, and actually think, are we actually creating great value from these relationships that they provide to us and then we provide to them? It's a different way of thinking. It's more circular than it is linear. So if we go back to purpose, clarity of scope, what's the advisory board there to do? The customer advisory board to do? What is it not? What's it not to do? Right, and so managing expectations of customers is very important, because you can create a lot of havoc if you don't think about why and what kind of feedback you actually want. Then with that clarity of scope, then comes into what kind of structure could work. So an advisory board could be a 3-month advisory board, and then the job is done and it's closed down. It doesn't need to be forever. Or it's an ongoing mechanism where you roll different customers through the model. So it can work in many, many different ways. It doesn't need to be a fixed structure. What I think is really important is around independence. Who is chairing that advisory board structure to make sure that you've got integrity in the way that information is managed, both at the advisory board table, but then also how it's disseminated back into the organisation. So no one's being played in those relationships. And I think that having the right protocols really keeps it really safe.
Okay, so is there a best practice around putting together a customer advisory board in that regard around, as you so rightly said, I mean, you could imagine the manipulation without even meaning to, but it's so tempting, isn't it? Oh, we've got our customers here. They're helping to make sure that they're under the tent. They're here with us, creating the future of our business. We're really collaborating with them. And if we extend that out across the ecosystem into, like you said, suppliers and other people where there's a value exchange in there, there's the temptation to perhaps want to kind of curate that somewhat. So how do you keep a chair independent, for example, and what's best practice around putting those protocols together?
Yeah, well, there are independent chairs in the market who specialise in this, right? And so that's what they do. They're independent. They're not a supplier. So there's no other agenda other than the agenda that's in front of you, right?
Yes.
And that's really important to escalate trust. And I was just, before speaking with you today, Ingrid, I was just on a call with a chair in Singapore, and the importance of customer advisory boards in that environment was to then inform the product development, so make sure that their future product was being informed by the customer, but also they weren't over-engineering it and doing the product development in a bubble without actually considering what the customer actually wants. And so for them, it's a really great return on investment model, because you can do a whole lot of research and development of a new product, and without the customer involvement in that pipeline, it's just been developed internally. And so this is where the sales function, the customer function, and the ongoing development function is a very effective sort of cycle.
That's extraordinary. And so is that what you meant before about, the structure of the customer advisory board? So it might be brought in, for example, to validate or to kind of test out the thinking behind, a new product or service development. Or it might be that, the structure itself turns over customers so that it keeps it kind of fair, it keeps it balanced. It ensures that there's fresh perspectives and it doesn't become its own little echo chamber. Is that what you meant about, there are various purposes for those customer advisory boards?
Yeah, and so give you an example of a well-known organisation that came to us to help them scope out, what their advisory board structure would be, was with their distribution reseller channel, and they decided to only have it as a 3-month advisory board structure because they didn't want those resellers to overstay they're welcome or feel like that they're actually providing advice back to the organisation, right? And so it's about being very clear and around the expectations of what those roles are, so you don't create dissatisfaction in that cycle by people thinking their role is something that it's actually not. So managing that. It's also interesting when you look at customer advisory boards. When we look at the aged care sector as an example, the customer may not necessarily be the end user, but it may be their family. It may be the broader ecosystem around them. And in some circumstances, a customer advisory board may actually not have a customer sitting on the advisory board, but it's like a panel that reviews customer feedback from a third party. So you've got actually a really good quality governance filter in that process, where it's not being filtered in or out by internal executives that may have a point of view around it and may interpret it differently. So there's some innovation that's happening around that whole customer advisory board experience.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. Can you talk us through some live examples that you might have come across or you know of that talks to the benefits of having a customer advisory board? I know that you've mentioned a few here. You've mentioned some examples around, product development. You've also mentioned some around the distributor model. But what about some other organisations that perhaps are a little bit smaller in nature that some of the listeners here might recognise themselves in and think, well, oh, okay, so that's what they've done. And that's what they've been able to get out of a customer advisory board that perhaps we're not even thinking about yet.
Well, if I look at it from a service provider's point of view, there's a guy, Dean Lindsay, that I interviewed many years ago, who's known as the customer advisory board guy in London, right? And so he actually works as a sales executive inside an organisation, and whenever he takes on a new role, he says the first thing I do is I set up a customer advisory board. So my role as an executive, I want to make sure that that we're being informed by the customer. And so for that, it gives a direct line through to the customer. And I guess the benefit from an executive point of view, Ingrid, you work with executives all the time. Yeah. How close do they actually get to the customer? CEOs, how often do they get to listen to the customer?
100%. And as a business grows, so that CEO, I mean, I can think there's one example I've got in my mind right now, and that person was the founder of this organisation. I mean, it eventually became a listed organisation. It did very well, very successful man, but could never quite, take his hands off being really right into the operational aspects of the business. And yet I would probably still say, even though he thought that he was probably, directly connected to the customer base, I think he's heavily reliant on the feedback from his salespeople and from his sales leader, so his GM of sales, which I think a lot of CEOs sort of fall into the trap of, which is a one-way kind of flow of information. And it's easy to kind of go, well, they're the people at the coalface, they're the people that are speaking with our customers all the time, I'll just go straight to them. And so they're that one step removed. And yet when it comes to developing products and services that are fit for purpose for the customer base, depending on how well your salespeople are engaging with that customer base and how well-rounded their insight is around also taking in other inputs, you're going to have some limitations. So I could imagine that by having a customer advisory board there as well, you're going to make sure that there is a far more well-rounded perspective from the customer insights point of view.
And keeping in touch with the market. It doesn't mean that you don't trust your executives, but you can get out of sync with the market really quickly. The further
Yeah.
you are away from it, because you are leading the organisation, you also have to lead the market at the
Yeah.
same time. And so, how do
Yes.
you do that to keep yourself in touch? Keep it real. Keep
Yes.
the leadership real and keep the leadership informed. And it could be the simplest thing, the shift in language, is something that the leader really, I think, has a sense of responsibility to do that as part of their whole stakeholder engagement. And I think this is where the future of leadership is going to be, Ingrid, where any public facing leader will need to demonstrate good due process in the way decisions are made, and customers, I think, really need to be part of that decision-making cycle somehow. Now, if we look at the financial services regulations in the UK that came out last year saying you must consider the customer in these regulations, but it doesn't actually say how. How do they actually listen to the customer? How do you listen with purpose to ensure that you don't that you keep in touch with the market?
Yeah, that's wow. I mean, that to me is the direction. Yep, that's really important about listening with purpose. That that phrase that you used then, I just thought, well, that's really important. But what I would also really love you to talk us through here is, the reality. Can any company put together a customer advisory board, or is it just, the bigger organisations? And if, for example, some of the people listening might say, well, actually, that sounds like a really good idea. How do I even go about doing that? What are the steps that you recommend that any organisation, any company could embark upon in order to make their own customer advisory board?
Yeah, look, the simpler it is, the better. But managing
Yes.
the ethical boundaries around it is really important. So it's important to know what you're doing. Really focus on the establishment phase. If you've never done it before, really think very carefully through. So normally when a business or an organisation establishes an advisory board, generally it takes them 3 months, 12 months. 12 months would be really long. Generally it takes 3 months to establish an advisory board, to really understand where it fits, what kind of structure, what kind of voices you want around the table, right? And then bringing those advisory board members on board, do an orientation with everybody, and then have your meeting cadence, whether it's like a 3-month advisory board or it's you meet 2 or 4 times a year with the advisory board structure. You build out that structure. There are professionals that specialise in this, so they are certified chairs, and they've got the protocols to do that. But the simpler that you operate it, the better it is.
Okay. Okay. Well, I like simplicity. I think that certainly works, because then you can make sure that you're not it's not becoming bigger than Ben-Hur. But is there a place where people can go to find out where to find these chairs, or what best practice actually looks like for a customer advisory board, or even just some questions that they could be reflecting on, or considerations for that matter, that might inform their approach and their thinking towards this?
Yeah, so there's a free service called the Advisor Concierge, run by the Advisory Board Centre. And so businesses, when they don't know what they need or who they need, we'll complete a scoping process with them up front to help them get started, right? Then we can connect them into the advisory board community, but they can engage with someone who's a certified chair, or they could do it themselves, but they'll get that independent sort of support in their thinking about what kind of structure they want in the first place. And then we've got a guide called the Advisor Concierge Guide, which helps them to guide them through the thinking process of what they need. So yeah, it's all there available for people to be able to use. There's also the ABF 101 Advisory Board Best Practice Framework. So they're the best practice principles that underline a quality advisory board. So that document is also free. That's developed by the Global Research Council, and those best practice principles are available to everybody. You just need to go to the website and download them. But that's generally a really good starting point. There's also a market report, Ingrid, called the State of the Market Report, and that talks about some of these really current big trends. And customer advisory boards is one of the biggest trends in the market today.
Oh, that's next level, Louise. Can I ask a really dumb question here? It might it might be stupid, but I'm going to ask it. Does it cost money? Do you need to pay customers to be part of an advisory board? What's the expectation and the obligation around, who sits in the types of roles that they play, or is it that the chair needs to be paid?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of different models in market. Some look at the ethics. There's a lot of situational ethics with advisory boards. Just need to navigate what's right for a particular situation. So chairs are generally paid for the work they do. That's like a monthly sort of fee to manage the whole process end to end. Some organisations say we want to pay the customers to make sure it's really clear and transparent. And that's their ethical stance on it. Others will say, ethically, we can't pay our customers because that puts us in a situation. So it's then working through, again, in the different scenarios, what's the best way to do it. Some say we have a standard fee, which is like an expense reimbursement back to the organisation because of the time that's being invested in making sure that our relationship is working well, right? So those models do vary from organisation to organisation. The other part of the customer advisory board piece I just want to mention, Ingrid, is not necessarily just about existing customers, but also customers that you don't have right now, but also future customers. And next generation advisory boards is a very exciting space, especially around digital transformation and the customer of the future. So next generation advisory boards is a very exciting space.
What's a next generation advisory board?
So if you think about what advisory boards are about, right, they're problem solving about the future.
Yep.
None of us have been there, right? And so we're all making it up, right? And the next generation coming through, it's our future, but it's more about their future. So when we're looking at what's next, we're going blue sky, it's optimistic. What do we do in the future? Instead of talking about the next generation, shouldn't we be including them in these conversations as well? And so having next generation coming through who are the future customer, what is it that they think now? What's going to be important to them? And this is where a lot of innovation also comes into play in these advisory board settings about the future customer.
Oh, that's extraordinary. I mean, my head goes to Gen Z. My head also goes to where it could be incredibly valuable to have all of the customers that, organisations have really missed out on engaging with, and they're not really sure why. Having them participate in, some of those conversations so that those gaps are more easily and more clearly identified, with some remedies also identified within that. And you talk about the digital transformation as well. I think that, in light of so much that we think we all have to do around AI, digital transformation, incorporating all of those generations in our customer base as well as in our workforce, as key stakeholders, we can over-engineer it really quickly because we're making assumptions based on what we think everyone needs, and we might base that even on some good research. But without actually physically engaging those people in those sorts of discussions, we're missing out on on what's really important to them, what matters to them, which is, a fundamental principle of what I think is best practice with engagement. And it's probably a lot simpler than we think, but we won't know that until we engage them.
And have real conversations. And it's not a let's do this and we're stuck with this model for the it's not a fixed structure, it's fluid.
Right.
And so you can experiment with it and say, well, let's try it this way. Let's not overcommit to something, but let's do something really, quarantine it, make it really simple, make it strong and learn from it, and then keep building it, because it doesn't need to be onerous. It's not expensive. But there's no problem with experimenting with it to then work out what's right for us. Because what's right for one organisation, it may not be the right approach for another one.
Do you know, Louise, I think that this is, how you said this is one of those, with that market report, and we'll put all of the links in the show notes here to all of the things that you've just referred to, particularly some of those resources that people can find at the Advisory Board Centre. But I really think that this is an area that I personally will be delving right into and recommending for my clients as best practice for them, with the advantages and benefits to them being exponential. Because as you're talking about all of the different ways in which these advisory boards can operate, I was thinking about, just the risks that these organisations can mitigate, the costs that they'll reduce, the upside to them, and the problems that they're going to be able to solve that they couldn't possibly achieve without that structure being in place. To me, this is a no-brainer, and I really would be strongly suggesting anyone who's listening to check out the Advisory Board Centre with the resources that they have available, and to be starting to think about, what your own customer advisory board might actually consist of, who it might consist of, and what the purpose might be, whether it be a short-term purpose or for a particular project, or whether it be something that you want to have in place ongoing to make sure that you're well informed. Is there anything else that you'd like to communicate across to the audience today, Louise, or anything else that we might not know?
No, I think you've got it covered, Ingrid. The bringing the outside in and bringing the customer in is, we talk about social impact. It's a great strategy to include your customers as part of your whole stakeholder mapping, your social responsibility, and also alignment with employees, with the customer. It's so important to all of us to know that the work that we're doing is meaningful, and this is a great way to be able to make that connection.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Louise. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time today, and I'm just so grateful that we met.
Likewise, thanks, Ingrid.
Thank you.